It wasn't dead. It wasn't a fossil. It wasn't a shadow, thrown by a bad angle or a trick of thermal contrast that a tired crew member misread at 3 in the morning after too many hours on shift. Whatever the thermal camera picked up that night, buried somewhere beneath the ranch in a stretch of tunnel nobody on the crew had mapped yet, was breathing. Slow, steady, unmistakable. A rise and fall of heat signature that no rock formation, no pocket of trapped gas, no equipment malfunction has ever been able to fully explain. And the man who caught it, the one everyone on site, had started calling Dragon long before that night, for reasons that had nothing to do with what he eventually found. Never spoke about it the same way again. This is a legend, told the way stories like this always are. Passed between people who worked near the site, retold by people who only heard fragments of it secondhand, shifting slightly every time it changes hands, but always circling back to the same handful of details that never seem to soften, no matter how many times the story gets told. It is not a claim about any real company, any real production, or any real named individual. Dragon isn't a real person's name. It's a nickname attached to a character in a story that has been circulating for years. The kind of story that survives specifically because nobody can fully confirm or deny it. According to the legend, Dragon had been on the crew longer than almost anyone else working the site. He'd earned the nickname early on. Not for anything dramatic, but for the way he handled the crew's thermal and infrared equipment. Patient, methodical, unbothered by long stretches of nothing showing up on a screen for hours at a time. Most of the crew treated overnight monitoring shifts as the least interesting part of the job, a necessary but tedious task that mostly involved staring at quiet readouts until sunrise. Dragon was one of the few who seemed to actually enjoy it. The kind of person who could sit with a thermal display for an entire shift without losing focus, convinced that eventually, if he watched closely enough, something would show up worth paying attention to. For most of his time on the crew, that patience hadn't produced much beyond the occasional coyote or nighttime bird crossing a monitored zone. The site itself had built up a reputation over the years, the same reputation that had justified bringing in a crew with this kind of specialized equipment in the first place. A long history of unexplained readings, strange local stories, and enough accumulated oddity that a serious investigation had eventually been commissioned to look into it properly. But reputation and confirmed evidence are two very different things, and for a long stretch of the investigation, Dragon's overnight shifts had mostly reinforced the boring, unglamorous truth that most nights, nothing happens. That reputation hadn't come from nowhere. Long before any formal survey crew ever arrived, people who'd lived near the ranch for generations had already compiled decades of their own informal accounts. Animals behaving strangely near certain sections of the property. Unexplained lights reported often enough that most locals had simply stopped mentioning them to outsiders. And a general, hard-to-articulate sense that certain parts of the land carried a different kind of weight than the rest. None of that constituted evidence in any formal sense. But it was enough, accumulated over enough years, to eventually attract the kind of serious, well-funded investigation capable of bringing in equipment sophisticated enough to actually test those old stories against something more rigorous than memory and rumor. That's the environment Dragon had been hired into, and it's part of why his patience during those long, uneventful overnight shifts mattered as much as it did. A crew member less familiar with the property's history might have treated an ambiguous thermal reading as a minor technical curiosity, worth a note in the log, and nothing more. Dragon had spent enough time immersed in the site's accumulated stories to know that ambiguous readings on a property like this one were exactly the kind of thing worth taking seriously, even when 9 times out of 10 they turned out to be nothing. That changed the night everything in this story actually starts. The crew had recently opened a new section of tunnel beneath the ranch, part of an expanding survey effort aimed at mapping subsurface structures the team suspected might connect to some of the property's more persistent surface-level anomalies. It wasn't a particularly deep or dramatic excavation by the standards of the rest of the investigation. A narrow access point, recently cleared, extending back into the rock far enough that the crew hadn't yet had time to fully document what was down there. Dragon's job that night was routine, Monitor the new section remotely, using a thermal camera lowered partway down the access shaft, watching for any temperature irregularities that might indicate airflow patterns, water intrusion, or structural instability worth flagging before anyone went down there in person. For the first few hours, the readout showed exactly what everyone expected. A stable, gradual cooling temperature gradient, consistent with undisturbed rock at that depth. No irregularities. Nothing worth noting beyond routine data logging. Then, a little after 2 in the morning, according to the story, something changed. A section of the display, roughly where the tunnel curved out of the camera's direct line of sight, began showing a heat signature that didn't match anything around it. Not dramatic at first. A subtle warm patch against the surrounding cold rock. The kind of reading that could plausibly be dismissed as a sensor glitch or a pocket of trapped air behaving unusually. Dragon logged it, the way he'd logged dozens of similarly ambiguous readings before, and kept watching, expecting it to fade the way most anomalies like this eventually did. It didn't fade. Over the following 20 minutes, the warm patch held steady, then began, almost imperceptibly, to shift position. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been obvious to someone glancing at the screen for a few seconds. But Dragon had spent years learning to notice exactly this kind of subtle, sustained movement, the difference between random sensor noise and something with actual shape and consistency holding together over time.
And what he was looking at, according to every version of this story, had a shape.
Something that stayed the same rough size and temperature as it moved. The unmistakable signature of a living body slowly repositioning itself in the dark, well beyond where the camera's normal field of view could confirm any visual detail. He didn't wake anyone immediately. That detail matters in how the story gets told, because it says something about how uncertain even Dragon was in that first moment, how much he still wanted to believe. There was a mundane explanation, waiting somewhere just out of view. He adjusted the camera angle remotely, trying to get a better read on the shape's outline. He checked every other sensor logging data from that same section of tunnel, looking for any secondary confirmation, or, just as importantly, any indication that the reading was simply a malfunction isolated to one piece of equipment. Nothing else in the tunnel showed anything unusual, just that one warm shape, moving slowly, deliberately, somewhere in the dark beyond where his camera could fully resolve it. It was another 20 minutes before he finally radioed it in, and according to the legend, his voice on that recording is notably calm, almost unnervingly so given what he was describing. He didn't call for an emergency response. He didn't sound panicked. He simply stated, as plainly as he could manage, that something in the new tunnel section appeared to be alive, and that he thought someone else needed to see the readout before he did anything else. A small group made it out to the monitoring station within the hour. By the time they arrived, the warm shape on the display had stopped moving entirely, settled into a steady, rhythmic pattern of heat fluctuation that several crew members would later describe, independently of each other, as looking almost exactly like slow, controlled breathing. Not the erratic signature of equipment malfunction, not the kind of steady baseline reading you'd expect from a stationary object retaining ambient heat. A rhythm. Consistent, patterned, and, by every account passed down in this legend, unmistakably biological in character. The crew spent the rest of that night trying to make sense of what they were looking at, without disturbing whatever was down there any further. Nobody suggested going down into the tunnel to check in person, not that night. Every instinct in the room, according to the story, pointed toward waiting, documenting, and figuring out a plan in daylight rather than approaching an unconfirmed, apparently living presence in a narrow, unmapped tunnel, in the dead of night with nothing but a handheld light, and whatever equipment happened to be on hand. By sunrise, the reading had faded entirely. Whatever had been generating that heat signature had either moved beyond the camera's range, settled into some kind of dormant state indistinguishable from the surrounding rock, or, in the version of the story that unsettles people most, simply stopped being detectable in a way that had nothing to do with movement at all. Have you ever caught something on a device that made your stomach drop the second you saw it? The kind of moment where you almost wish the equipment had simply been broken instead. And for everyone hearing this story tonight, What convinces you faster when something like this gets described secondhand? A photo, a sound, or the way a person's voice changes when they try to explain what they saw? Because the way Dragon's voice changed after that night is, according to almost every version of this legend, the detail that convinced the rest of the crew. This wasn't simply an equipment glitch being overanalyzed by an exhausted overnight worker. In the days that followed, the crew made 2 separate attempts to physically investigate the section of tunnel where the reading had originated. Both attempts, according to the story, turned up nothing conclusive. No visible tracks, no disturbed debris beyond what the crew's own equipment had already accounted for, no physical evidence of anything living having occupied that space recently. That absence of physical confirmation should have been reassuring. Instead, it became one more layer of the mystery, because it meant the only evidence anyone had was the recorded thermal footage itself, footage that, according to those who reviewed it afterward, was consistent enough in its rhythm and shape that dismissing it as noise required actively ignoring what was plainly visible on the screen. Dragon, according to the legend, was never quite the same on overnight shifts after that. He kept working the site for a while longer, kept monitoring the same equipment he always had, but crew members who worked alongside him in the following weeks described someone noticeably more alert, more hesitant to dismiss ambiguous readings the way he once might have.
He stopped treating quiet stretches of a shift as simply uneventful.
According to a few versions of the story, he started requesting a second person present for any overnight monitoring near that specific section of tunnel, a request the crew's supervisors reportedly granted without much discussion, which itself tells you something about how seriously the incident had been taken internally, regardless of what official explanation, if any, was ever settled on. There's a smaller detail some versions of the legend include about Dragon, specifically, that's easy to miss, but tends to stay with people once they notice it. In the weeks following that night, he reportedly kept a personal log separate from the crew's official documentation, a habit none of his coworkers recalled him having before. He never shared its contents with the rest of the team, and by most accounts, he stopped keeping it entirely not long before he eventually moved on from the site altogether. Whether that log ever contained anything beyond his own private attempt to process what he'd seen, or whether it held additional detail he chose never to share with anyone, is something the legend has never resolved, and likely never will. The tunnel section itself was eventually sealed off from the rest of the survey work, cordoned away from the broader excavation effort while the crew focused their remaining time on other, less ambiguous areas of the property. No formal report explaining the decision was ever circulated widely among the rest of the crew, at least according to how the story gets told. It's simply stopped being part of the active investigation, quietly removed from the schedule the way inconvenient, unresolved details sometimes are when a project needs to keep moving forward without getting permanently stuck on a single unanswered question. It's worth pausing here to weigh the different ways a story like this could actually make sense. The same way any legend built around an unverified, unconfirmed event deserves genuine scrutiny rather than simple, uncritical acceptance. There's the technical explanation, the one that has to be considered first regardless of how compelling the footage sounds secondhand. Thermal cameras, especially in remote, poorly ventilated underground environments, can produce misleading readings under a range of ordinary conditions. Trap pockets of warmer air shifting slowly through natural convection, condensation interacting unpredictably with temperature sensors, or subtle equipment drift that produces a false impression of movement and rhythm where none actually exists. A tired crew member, primed by a site's existing reputation for strangeness, might reasonably interpret an ambiguous but technically explainable reading as something considerably more significant than it actually was. There's the wildlife explanation, one that doesn't require anything beyond an animal already living somewhere within an unmapped section of tunnel, long before the crew ever arrived to survey it. Underground environments across the world regularly house creatures that avoid daylight entirely. Animals whose presence would naturally produce exactly the kind of warm, moving heat signature described in this story, without requiring any explanation beyond ordinary biology reacting to an unfamiliar disturbance in its own established territory. And then there's the explanation this legend keeps circling back to. The one that never fully lets go, no matter how many mundane possibilities get offered first. That whatever dragon detected that night wasn't simply a known animal reacting to an intrusion. And wasn't simply a technical artifact either, but something that had been present beneath that property for far longer than any crew, any survey, or any official investigation had ever accounted for. Something the site's decades of accumulated strange stories had always pointed toward without anyone ever managing to confirm it directly, until one overnight shift, on one otherwise unremarkable night, briefly did. None of these explanations are confirmed, and the legend, true to its nature, refuses to settle on one. That refusal is exactly why this particular story has kept circulating among people who worked adjacent to the site, or heard about it from someone who did, long after the crew that documented it originally moved on to other projects entirely. There's a detail worth including here that rarely survives the shorter, more compressed versions of this story, but tends to stick with people once they hear it in full. The kind of detail that only ever surfaces when someone tells the entire version, rather than the abbreviated one. Years after the tunnel section was sealed off, a few former crew members who'd since moved on to unrelated work were reportedly asked, informally, whether they'd ever go back and investigate that same section again, if given the opportunity. According to the story, nearly all of them said no, not out of any dramatic, obvious fear, but with a kind of quiet, settled certainty that whatever answer they might eventually find wouldn't be worth disturbing something that had apparently been content to stay hidden for as long as anyone could reasonably tell. That's a strange kind of ending for a story built around a moment of genuine, documented discovery. Most legends like this build toward either confirmation or debunking. Some kind of clean resolution that finally settles the question one way or the other, closing the door on further speculation. This one never quite gets there, and it likely never will. It ends instead with a sealed tunnel, a single night of thermal footage that has never been fully explained by anyone who saw it, and a crew who collectively decided, without ever fully articulating why out loud, that some questions are better left exactly where they were originally found. So here's where we finally leave it, the same way this story has always been left, with everyone who's heard it before. If your own equipment showed you something breathing in a place nothing living should have been, would you want to go back down and confirm it for yourself, no matter what it cost you to find out? Or would Dragon's own quiet, unshaken calm that night, the fact that even he never pushed to go further, never demanded a full investigation, never tried to prove definitively what he'd seen, be reason enough to leave that tunnel exactly as sealed as the crew ultimately left it, and let the story stay exactly as unfinished as it's always been?